So if you want to store and recall different setups during a show, then the way to do that is by using snapshots. There are a number of applications for snapshots, but in our particular show here, which is a live broadcast, we're using it to store and recall different setups for different users. I can look at the snapshots list by pressing the snap button and looking at the snapshot list display. Here on the left-hand side, you'll see we've got some folders that we made earlier for me and also for Tom. So in my snapshots list, I can come in and find my show start snapshot, right-click, load that in, and that will reset everything across the console. It'll reset signals, my actual mix settings, also which channels and which VCA groups in this case are assigned to the different fader strips. So I'm using it here for the start of the show. When the production flips later to just the guests in the studio, I can load the studio layout to bring up my microphone channels in this area here, closer to me. If we have a look at a different example, there's a production here called Live Show from a theatre production. So if I change the production by loading that in from the productions list, and then we have a look at the snapshots within this file, we'll find a different folder. This time it's been called Saturday for Saturday's performance, and we have a snapshot for each scene that they're using within the live theatre show. Again, just right-click to load, and that will reset the console. In the example we've got here, we have some VCA masters controlling the band, the effects, and also the soloist channels. In the next scene, when I load scene 2, we'll see that the soloists update for the right levels and the mix settings for that particular scene. Again, just select a snapshot and push the load key to step through the different snapshots. If I want to add more settings to this, then I can make changes to my mix parameters. I could also change what channels are on fader strips. I could also change things in the signal list. And when I've made those changes, just click on Save to save a new snapshot with its date and timestamp. And I can name that if I want to later. Remember to update the production to save any new snapshots into the production file. When it comes to recalling snapshots, then at the moment everything is being recalled globally across the console. But we'll find on the fader user buttons, one of the common functions here is a snap ISO function. So we can press this if we wish to isolate particular channels from the snapshot recall. So for example, if I've started my show at scene 1, and I'd actually like to drive the soloist channels manually rather than letting the snapshots do the work, I can isolate those particular fader strips, recall the next scene, and they are isolated from the recall. You'll also find on the snapshots display some global snapshot ISO buttons. These are a more global way of isolating different parameters from the recall. So for example, if we select connections, that will stop a snapshot resetting any of the signal connections in the signal list display. Okay, so if you're using snapshots, for example, in a live theatre show, where you might have lots of different snapshots for all the different scenes, and this is the same show that you do every night, then rather than having to select a snapshot and press a load button, that's 2 operations, we can create a sequence and turn on the sequence automation so that we can use this area of controls to step through the next snapshot as each scene cue arrives. The way I do that is by pressing the Snap Sequence button again to look at the Sequences page. And in here I have 4 areas. So I have my folder where we stored our snapshots called Saturday. Earlier I created a new sequence and I made it active. And in that sequence I have my list of snapshots for my 3 scenes. If there's another snapshot I want to add to that list, like snapshot 4, then just right-click and select Add, and that adds the snapshot into the sequence. Once you have prepared your sequence, then from the center section, you're ready to start the show and you enable the sequence automation, and you'll see the next button lights up and also the next status flag lights on the GUI. So I know that now scene 1 is the next snapshot that will load when I push the next button. So when the cue comes in, I push next and the console loads scene 1. The GUI updates, so we can see this is now the current snapshot. My intermediary snapshot here, 4, is next in the list. If I keep pushing next, we step through the scenes of the show. If I got the wrong and the cue came too early, there is a back button, so we can revert back to the previous snapshot. There are another 2 pages beneath the snap sequence button, so we have snapshot trim sets. This is used again in a live production if you need to override some settings in a temporary way. So, for example, Saturday's show is usually with Soloist A. All my snapshots, my millions of snapshots for the different scenes are all saved with that soloist in mind, but he's off sick and we have to have a different actor. So Soloist B, I can have prepared an oversnap with different parameter settings because perhaps he needs a different EQ and a different compressor and a different main fader level. And anything that's in this current trim set area will then be applied to the snapshot recalls. So again, I would operate the console exactly the same way as before, stepping through the different snapshots, but now these parameters will be applied as an absolute value on top of the data in my 48 snapshots. The last page under the snapshots button are the ISO sets. And this is another way again of isolating individual components from the snapshot recall. So earlier we used the snap ISO button to isolate the whole of the channel strip. But in this page we can take an individual channel, for example Soloist 1, and we can choose just to isolate the EQ, the filter, perhaps the compressor, perhaps the input stage. This can be very useful, for example, if a microphone has failed and you've had to use an emergency backup microphone, you just want to put those components into like a manual mode so that you can adjust your settings manually. But everything else within that channel would be recalled by the snapshots, so all your fader level changes and other changes will be applied. All of these parameters are stored in the production when you update the production from the top of the console.